Two managers, same industry, faced the same warning from the same kind of nervous employee. Both run the numbers, cost of stopping the line against the odds of failure, and decide the risk is probably fine. Neither is lying to themselves. They've made this call before and it's always worked out. In one company, it works out again. Nothing happens. And nobody outside that room hears about it. In the other, 6 weeks later, a piece of machinery fails on the floor, and someone doesn't walk out of that building the way they walked in. One manager keeps their job, maybe even gets praised for staying on schedule. The other is named in an investigation, remembered by co-workers, by a courtroom, as the kind of person who let this happen. But they made the identical decision, same information, same risk, same reasoning. The only difference was what happened afterward. It isn't only workplaces. Picture two people, each furious after a fight, each firing off a cruel message to someone they love. One lands on an ordinary Tuesday, a flash of hurt, and by next week it's just a story about a bad night. The other lands during the worst week of someone's life, a week the sender never knew about, and that message becomes something the recipient carries for years. Same cruelty, same intention, a different verdict handed down by nothing but timing. Or picture two parents, each stretched too thin, each stepping away from a bathtub for what feels like 30 seconds because the phone is ringing. One comes back to a kid, splashing, mildly annoyed. For the other, those 30 seconds become the line that divides the family's life into before and after. None of these people would describe what they did the same way once they knew how it ended. Ask them the morning before, and it was just an ordinary call among 100 others. They didn't know how it would end when they did it. The decision was made in the dark, on partial information, guessing at odds nobody could calculate. Whatever moral difference we end up assigning between them, the part that later separates one verdict from the other showed up with the outcome. It wasn't sitting there at the moment of decision. We still judge people by what they decided. That much doesn't disappear. But the outcome moves in right behind the decision and reshapes the judgment of it, amplifying it, softening it, sometimes crowding it out almost entirely, until what happened next starts standing in for what was chosen. Philosophers have a name for the discomfort sitting underneath that. It's called moral luck, and it points at something most people notice at some point in their lives, usually in a private and uncomfortable moment, and then work fairly hard not to look at directly ever again. That a meaningful share of how good or bad you appear to other people, and eventually to yourself, depends on factors you never had any real control over. In 1976, Bernard Williams and Thomas Nagel published paired essays under the title Moral Luck. Nagel's began as a reply to Williams's. Between them, the two essays put real pressure on an idea that feels obviously right at first glance, that moral judgment should depend only on what's actually up to a person, their intentions, their choices, the character they've built, not chance, not circumstance, not whatever the universe happened to be doing at the time. That idea holds together fine in the abstract. It gets much harder to hold on to once you look closely at an actual human life, because almost nothing plays out purely on the strength of what was up to that person alone. What Williams and Nagel left behind wasn't a resolution. It was a precise name for a tension that philosophers are, to this day, still arguing over. To take this seriously instead of just feeling vaguely uneasy about it, it helps to separate four things that we usually mash together into a single, seamless verdict. There's the choice itself, the actual decision the manager, the person with the phone, the parent by the water, made in the moment, with only the information they had directly in front of them at the time. There's the risk that choice carried, which is not nothing. The manager knew there was some real chance of failure buried in that shortcut. The person with the phone knew exactly how much those words could cut, because that's precisely why they chose them. The parent knew, somewhere underneath the exhaustion, that a bathtub is not nothing, that water and small children are not a combination you get to be casual about. Nobody in any of these stories is innocent of having taken a risk. That part is real and it belongs to them. There's the outcome, the machine failing or holding, the message landing on an ordinary week or a devastating one, the child splashing or drowning. This part was never fully theirs to begin with. A person chooses an action and accepts the risk that comes bundled with it, but nobody fully controls how every variable in the world converges to produce the actual result. They choose the odds they're willing to live inside of. What those odds resolve into is only partly up to them. And then there's a fourth thing, quieter than the other three, the one that often carries a disproportionate share of the emotional and moral judgment we form about a person, while getting only a fraction of the scrutiny it deserves, the extra weight we add after the fact, once we already know how the story ended. That weight gets glued onto the original choice retroactively, as though it had been sitting there all along, as though the manager whose machine failed was always more reckless than the one whose didn't, as though the parent whose child drowned was always more negligent than the one whose child was fine. The choice itself didn't get worse in hindsight. The story wrapped around it did. Go back to the manager for a moment and hold all four of these apart deliberately instead of letting them blur into one impression. The choice was real. Ignore the warning. Keep the line running. The risk was real too, and the manager knew roughly what it was, the same way anyone who's cut a corner before knows roughly what they're cutting. The outcome, whether the machine happened to fail that particular week or not, belonged to physics, timing, and 100 variables nobody in that room was tracking. And the fourth thing, the moral weight that only shows up once the outcome is known, is the part doing almost all the talking whenever someone says afterward, "I always knew that guy was reckless." He wasn't more reckless than his counterpart at the other company. He was reckless in the same way, and unlucky in a way his counterpart simply wasn't. Luck in outcome, as vivid as it is, turns out to be only the most visible layer of the problem. Once you start looking for it, moral luck shows up in places nobody ever consciously chose to stand. There's luck in circumstance. The employee who was simply never offered the bribe never had to find out, under real pressure, whether they'd have turned it down. The friend who was never tested by a situation ugly enough to reveal what they're actually capable of gets to walk around for years believing something quietly flattering about their own character, untested, unearned, and very possibly mistaken for virtue, right up until the day life finally does test them and the story turns out different than they assumed. There's luck in constitution, the temperament, upbringing, and early conditions nobody chooses before they're shaped by them. One person grows up with something close to a long fuse, patient almost without trying, and spends a lifetime being praised for a calm they barely had to build. Another person is shaped towards something much shorter, by temperament, by an early environment that rewarded vigilance over ease, by any number of influences that landed unevenly, and has to work against that inheritance every day just to get somewhere near where the first person started at rest. Effort still counts here. People do change their temper, their patience, their habits, often through real and difficult work. But the starting distance was never handed out evenly. The person who had less of it to cover rarely gets credited for the head start, and the person still working against a harder inheritance often gets treated as though the struggle itself were the character flaw. And underneath both of those sits an even colder layer still, the luck of cause and effect, running back further than anyone can fully trace. Much of who a person becomes, their temperament, their habits, even values that feel entirely self-authored, the ones they'd swear they arrived at through pure reflection, took shape inside a long causal chain. A childhood nobody designed, a family nobody selected, a set of early experiences that arrived before anyone involved had a vote. Follow that chain back far enough, honestly, and the line between who I am and what happened to me gets thinner than it's comfortable to admit. It doesn't vanish, though. People still deliberate, respond to reasons, revise their habits, and remain answerable for what they do. Moral life, as we ordinarily practice it, leans heavily on taking those capacities seriously. But nobody built the ground they were standing on the first time they started making those choices. None of this turns people into weather systems, blameless and swept wherever the current goes. It means the ground someone is standing on at the exact moment they make a choice was never entirely built by them in the first place, no matter how much the choice itself still belongs to them once they're standing there. We do this to each other constantly, almost never noticing it happening in real time. We meet someone who's never had an affair and file them under faithful when the truer, less comfortable story might be that they were simply never once tempted the way someone else was at 2 in the morning by exactly the wrong person wanting them back at the wrong moment. We meet someone who's never lost their temper in public and call them even-keeled, grounded, easy to be around, without ever knowing whether they've never been pushed the way another person has been pushed over and over by pressures that happened to never once land on us. And here's the part most people would genuinely rather not sit with. Run this same logic on yourself, honestly, instead of only on strangers. Think about every reckless thing you've ever done that somehow didn't turn into a disaster, the message you almost sent, and did send anyway, the corner you cut at work that nobody happened to notice that time. The 30 seconds you weren't watching someone you loved because your attention had drifted somewhere else entirely. You call that fine, nothing happened, and then, without quite meaning to, you folded into the evidence file for being a careful person. But nothing happened is not the same claim as I was careful. Sometimes it only means the story stopped one beat before it had the chance to turn on you the way it turned on someone else. Or think about the time you talked a friend into a risk that wasn't really yours to take, a career move, a loan, a bet on a person, or a plan you were more confident about than the facts actually justified. It worked. They thanked you for it, later, more than once. File that under good instincts if you want, but be honest about what you actually knew at the time, which was considerably less than the outcome now makes it look like you knew. If it had gone the other way, you'd have been the reason it went wrong, remembered that way for years. Instead, you're remembered as someone with good judgment, and the only thing standing between those two versions of you was something that had nothing to do with your judgment at all. That's an uncomfortable thing to believe about yourself, so most people quietly don't. It's much easier and much more flattering to believe the outcome proves something real about your character, that the good ending was earned through who you fundamentally are, and that the bad ending, if it had come for you instead, would have been earned too by someone worse. It's a way of protecting a fragile and mostly false idea that you are in control of considerably more of your own life than you actually are. None of this, though, is a case for shrugging off what you do. And it's worth being precise here because that's the trap sitting on the opposite side of this same idea, and it's just as dishonest as the first one. The manager who ignored the warning still made the decision to ignore it. That choice was real, it was still theirs, and it deserves scrutiny whether or not the machine ever failed afterward. The person who sent that message still chose the specific cruelty inside it. The words were aimed on purpose, not launched by accident or bad luck of their own. The parent still made the actual call to step away, weighing a phone call against a child near water in a decision that was theirs to make either way. A bad outcome doesn't retroactively summon a bad choice into existence out of nowhere, but a good outcome doesn't retroactively launder a bad choice clean either. Nobody gets to reach for, well, nothing happened, as a verdict on their own conduct, the same way nobody else gets to blame a person entirely for the one piece of the outcome they genuinely never had access to or control over. Responsibility for the choice and responsibility for the outcome are not the same account, no matter how badly we'd like to collapse them into one number, and it's tempting, in both directions, to let one stand in for the other whenever it's convenient. None of this means outcome and choice deserve exactly the same weight in every sense, or that we should just abandon judging by results altogether. Two people who made equally reckless choices, who accepted equally reckless risks, can reasonably be evaluated alike for the choice itself. That much holds regardless of how either story ended. But the moment real harm enters the picture, something enters with it that has nothing to do with character. An actual victim, an actual loss, a debt that now exists and didn't exist before. The dropped cigarette that catches on a bone-dry hillside creates something the one that dies out harmlessly on wet pavement does not. A fire, a duty to put it out, damage that has to be repaired by somebody, whether or not the hand that dropped it was any more careless than the other one. That difference is real, and it's reasonable for it to trigger a different practical response, restitution, consequence, repair, aimed at what actually happened rather than at what almost happened. What that difference doesn't do is prove the two people were different underneath, or that one of them was more careless by nature than the other. Three different questions are getting collapsed into one here, and it helps to hold them apart. Whether the choice itself was responsible, whether the resulting harm now calls for repair, and whether the person's entire character deserves judgment based on this single result. The first question was already settled before anyone knew how things would turn out. The third is the one people reach for automatically, and it's the one the other two were never equipped to answer. A different response to the damage is not the same claim as a different verdict on the person who caused it. So the tension stays open on both sides at once. Outcomes matter enough that real harm can't be treated as morally weightless, since it creates victims, and obligations a near miss doesn't. And outcomes are unearned enough that they can't function as a clean measure of virtue or guilt, however naturally we reach for them that way. Practical response and character judgment are not the same instrument, even when we're holding both of them in the same hand. What's left once you stop trying to force all of this into something tidier than it is, isn't relief. And it probably shouldn't be. It's a kind of clarity that's harder to carry than either of the comfortable illusions on either side of it. The illusion that you fully control your own outcomes, and the opposite illusion that outcomes don't count for anything at all. It asks you to hold yourself fully to the choice and to the risk you took, without hiding behind however things happened to turn out afterward. And it asks you at the same time to loosen your grip a little on judging someone else's entire character by their single worst day, or on crediting your own character for the disasters that simply never arrived to test it. The manager whose machine held, the person whose message happened to land softly, the parent whose child was fine. None of them were necessarily better underneath than the version of themselves standing in the wreckage on the other side of that exact same story. In a real number of cases measured honestly, they were only luckier. The harder, more honest thing, the thing worth taking from all of this, is learning to know the difference on your own, even on the days when nobody is standing there asking you to.